You just won't die with this rogue build in Diablo 4. Even if you grind in a nightmare dungeon where enemies are 10 levels higher than you are, you can just stand still, press a couple of buttons and kill everyone around. And you deal enormous damage, by the way. The only challenge appears in nightmare dungeons where enemies are 20 levels higher than you. So let's take a look at the skills. First of all, here we're gonna be using a combination of blade shift and flurry. And there's really a very important reason why we want the blade shift. It's because we want this non-physical damage resistance and the reduction of the duration of incoming control and parent effects, all granted by the primary blade shift passive. So yeah, we want to make our character as tanky as possible. And now moving to the core ability main for this build, it's flurry. We get extra heal from enhanced flurry. Actually, we heal ourselves when damaging crowd-controlled enemies, which would be pretty much all enemies all the time. And here is something unusual. I choose advanced flurry. Evading through an enemy will cause your next flurry to stun enemies for 2.5 seconds. Next thing we have is damage reduction from sturdy, and yet more healing from siphoning strikes. When we critically strike an enemy, 3% of the maximum health is healed. So we in fact have 3 different sources of self-heal in this build. 2 of those from skills and 1 from an aspect. Because yes, items are a very important part of this build and we will talk about them later in detail. Next skill we have is Shadow Step, but we don't actually use it to initiate fights, but rather as an escape option. For it grants us unstoppable, that's why we use Disciplined Shadow Step to reduce cooldown. I think also a pretty important passive for this build would be Reactive Defense, because again, we're only gonna be dying when stunned, so we would actually benefit from this extra 18% of damage reduction. And we move on. Weapon Mastery is a must in pretty much any build in my opinion. We got quite standard passives here. Exploit comes for extra damage for healthy and injured, and Malice for extra damage to vulnerable enemies. Now next thing, this build uses 2 different kinds of imbuement, poison and cold. Both of those will help us survive in tough fights, because cold imbuement will chill and freeze enemies, and frozen enemies obviously can't attack you. Plus you deal a lot of additional damage to the frozen or chilled enemies. That's why we also pick Frigid Finesse, exactly for this kind of extra damage. And speaking about poison imbuement, we don't really care about poison damage, but we sure want these debuffs. Poisoned enemies deal 15% less damage, and also we are getting increased attack speed for each enemy we are poisoning, and that's also important since we use combo points. As an ultimate here I use Shadow Clone with both improvements to first of all make the Shadow Clone do extra damage, but most importantly to provide us another source of becoming unstoppable for higher survivability, and the Aftermath passive that helps us restore ultimate. Because if we think about it, yes, this build is extremely tanky, it deals a high amount of damage, but we might experience some issues with energy management. Only when we fight a single target actually, but there will be such situations. That's why I usually keep Shadow Clone activated when I run out of energy in a tough fight. Our key passive is Momentum, and I know it's not the most popular key passive, but it's really good for survivability in tough fights. This happens because when we have 3 stacks of Momentum, we get an increased damage reduction, increased energy regeneration, and increased movement speed. Now let's proceed to items, because there are quite a few that you definitely need to have for this build. For instance, check out this aspect. You gain 0.5% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 50%. It's an absolute must-have for any rogue build. I mean, if you want to prevent your rogue from dying, you need this aspect. And frankly, I believe that at some point it's gonna be nerfed, because as for now it's just too strong. And hey guys, a link to a complete build with all the aspects and all the skills and the main paragon that I'm choosing you can find in the pinned comment. Now next aspect that we want to take is an item for additional reduction of damage from crowd-controlled enemies. Another defensive aspect that I think is really necessary is this one. Basic skill grants 20% damage reduction for 5.5 seconds. This means that by hitting enemies with Blade Shift, we not only get a certain amount of damage reduction from this passive, but also more damage reduction from the aspect. Speaking about boots, you should have boots with additional evade charges, because we're gonna be evading through enemies all the time to stun them. On our main weapon we want to use an aspect that lets So flurry, damage enemies in circle and deal additional 30% increased damage. I think these aspects should be used on the main weapon because most of our damage comes from flurry and all the imbuements and everything else is just a way to buff this ability. To deal as much damage as possible, I'm using this unique dagger that allows our core skill to deal 40% increased damage when we have 3 combo points. There's also 30% chance that the basic skill will grant not just 1 but 3 combo points. It's a really solid item as long as you use combo points, and it actually drops quite often. Next important item, not really must-have type but still very good, is this one. Distant enemies have an 8% chance to be stunned for 2 seconds when they hit you, but the most important thing is that you deal extra damage to stunned enemies, and quite a lot of them will be stunned. It's in fact one of the ways to crowd control the enemies. On the amulet we have an additional heal. Each stack of the momentum, the key passive, heals you for 400 health per second, and guys, it's just an enormous heal. And what's even more amazing is that we are gonna be healed even when stunned, and that's why I think that this one is so good. Another absolute must-have for this build: if you don't have this aspect, you'll have to find another way to restore energy, for example by using shadow imbuement instead of cold imbuement or something else. Anyway, you gain 16 of your primary resource for every 25% of your life that you heal, and you heal yourself constantly. This is why in the middle of massive fights against numerous enemies, you are very unlikely to ever run out of energy. And now just a really quick glance at the Paragon board. There are different ways to make a Paragon board for this build. You can go with extra damage from multiple sources, but I chose this, Control. Additional damage to crowd controlled enemies, and above these 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. Next we have a critical strike damage with core skill, and very important is that those strikes restore 12% of their energy cost. Additionally, we have some rare nodes for core skill damage, and as for a legendary node I chose Cheap Shot. You deal 5% increased damage for each nearby enemy that is crowd controlled up to 25%, which will mean 25% practically always except when you fight a single target. And the last glyph I use here is an absolute must. If you unlocked only one Paragon board, I'd suggest you use this one, and later you can add other glyphs. It's called Exploit, and it grants us additional damage against vulnerable enemies, but what's the most important, when you damage an enemy they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. And now how this build works. We initiate fight with our evade, then we use flurry, stun enemies and apply poison imbuement on any enemies so that they deal less damage. What we do next is we just start hitting them with basic attacks, and when we have 3 combo points we use another flurry. In this case your damage reduction is so high that you will not be dying like ever as long as you keep on fighting. So guys, this was a melee build, and if you're interested in a cool ranged build, check out my video that's on your screen now. I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you for your attention. Bye bye.